Welcome to FO Talks. With me is Manu Sharma, a partner at FOI, a political and geopolitical risk advisory. Manu advises businesses and governments in Asia, Africa, Europe, and the Americas. He's widely known to be an outstanding macroeconomist, if not by profession, then by interest, an excellent pollster or psephologist, and an all-right, jolly good chap. Welcome, Manu.
Thank you, Atul. Thank you for this boisterous introduction. It's really good to be with you to discuss this topic.
And the topic is Indian elections. So without further ado, let's get cracking. We are discussing the biggest election ever in history. I don't even know how many 100 million people are voting. Some say 800, some say 900. The mind boggles. But let's begin with the question of the integrity of the election process. Arguably the most important aspect of any democracy. Do Indians cast their votes without fear or favor? Are their votes counted? Do candidates accept the results of the election? We know in some parts of the world, I'm sitting in Washington, D.C., that sometimes some people might not even accept that the elections were free and fair. So these are monumental questions in a country with mammoth elections. So over to you, sir. Educate us.
All right. So there are quite a few questions, wrapped within the first statement. So I'll begin with the question of, let's say, how free and fair the elections are. But, that question sort of gets answered with the process of elections themselves. So how elections take place in India. This is just a background for the viewers. So the elections in India are held for a parliamentary assembly. That assembly goes on to choose the cabinet and also the prime minister, who virtually runs the country, or the central government as we call it. And in other parts of the world,
you mean
call the federal government.
You mean the parliament itself, right? The legislature. And it's the lower house of the legislature.
Lower house of
Lok
the
Sabha.
legislature, quite akin to the House of Commons in the UK.
In Britain.
Yes, that's the template that Indians chose for their democracy. So we follow a Westminster democracy, and within that you have what are called constituencies or seats, as they are called colloquially. So Lok Sabha seats, about 543, they go to the polls across the length and breadth of the nation. And from each seat, you have an elected member of parliament, or an MP. The party that gets the majority of the seats, that is 272, gets to elect, its own government. And in case of a hung
By the way, it could be a coalition too, not necessarily a party.
Yeah. In case of a hung parliament, what you have is sometimes there's a pre-poll coalition, and at times there's a post-poll coalition that comes to take power. So India has experimented in the past with single-party rule, that is, single-party majority, then you've had multiple coalitions with sometimes a strong central party, but at other times you would have what you can call equal number of players. And at times you've even had smaller parties, which were technically called the minority party rule, forming the government by using a tactic called the outside support. So you would have the larger party basically sitting out of the government corridors, supporting a smaller party to run the country. And I guess India is pretty unique in that sort of an experiment for a country this large to be run by a party that didn't even get, let's say, 20% of the seats, but was, electing the prime minister of the country in the Lok Sabha. So
You're referring to Charan Singh. You're referring to Charan Singh back in the 70s. You're referring to Chandrasekhar.
Yes.
Arguably even Deve Gowda.
Yes. So, we've had these prime ministers who did not actually have more than even 20% of the seats, or even 15% at times in the Lok Sabha, but they were able to form the government because of the vagaries of the coalition politics. So, that is about how the prime minister and the cabinet are elected once the MPs are elected. Then we go down to how the MPs are elected. Well, India follows a system called First Past the Post system, FPTP, which basically means that any number of candidates can contest for the Lok Sabha or the parliamentary seat, and the result of that election is decided by who gets the plurality of votes or maximum number of votes. So it's like this, that the person who gets
the majority
elected,
of votes, basically.
not really majority. This is where it gets interesting. That you have
I say not the majority. I rephrase them, which gets the most votes. So if there are many parties and a candidate gets 34% of the vote and the rest, say 66% of the votes are divided between 10 parties, the chap who gets 34% of the vote gets to be MP.
Yeah, so to win the election, all you have to do is just get one vote more than the person placed second, and and you become an MP. So what that results in? It results in, especially in the past, political parties with relatively narrow social base of about 20%, 30% of the electorate, comfortably winning elections. And as a result of this system, no political party in the history of Indian elections has been able to win 50% or more vote share nationally. Even the fabled Congress of the Nehru era could not notch up 50% vote share nationally. So this is where we stand. So if you were to basically analyze the elections from the prism of vote share, it may appear like that most parties are hovering between, when they win the elections, 30 to 40%. I mean, that's a winning performance. In other democracies, it may look like a low figure, because they would say that if you have to win an election, then you need to have a majority of the votes. But this is how the Indian system is configured, and it follows the template of the British parliamentary system.
Yeah.
Yes.
But the UK is different. The UK is not so big. The UK has two main parties and a third party called the Liberal Party, which basically after World War One petered out. It has always been a third party in British politics. And there is also the fact that in the UK, until recently, you didn't really have regional parties. Only the emergence of the Scottish National Party has brought in regional parties. In India, Tamil Nadu has the Dravida Munnetra Kazhagam. I don't even pronounce it well. Kazhagam. You have the communists in Kerala. In West Bengal, now you have the Trinamool Congress, an offshoot, a breakaway offshoot of the Congress. We could go on, but the point is that in India, parliamentary democracy is far more complicated because of the scale and size of the country as compared to the British model.
Indeed. And, from there follows a lot of confusion about whether the Indian election is fair enough, or, how do we know that this process has sufficient level of integrity associated with it, whether people are without fear or favor when they're casting their votes. So all that. So, I'll begin with once we have squared out this, once we've explained that basically what the Indian elections are, let's move to what happens in an election. So what happens in an election is that every seat, every Lok Sabha seat from which an MP is elected, is further divided into voting booths or polling booths. those polling booths are often situated in the community area, of the voters themselves. So it's not the case that people have to travel from this neighborhood to that neighborhood, or they have to go to somewhere else to cast their votes. So they go out, go to the polling station, and within that polling station, what happens is that there are workers of all political parties present to counter check the voting list. So, for example, I go to vote, and if I'm going to vote, there will be uh, workers from the opposition party, there will be workers from the independent candidates, there will be workers from the party in power, and all of them would go through the voting list to check my credentials if there is something that could be challenged with the officer presiding. If not, I proceed to the electronic voting machine, and over there I cast a secret ballot. That is, nobody, not even the presiding officer within the polling booth, is allowed to see who am I casting my vote for. Now, one might say that this is all fine in theory. What happens in practice? Well, what happens in practice is quite close to this. That what you have is, in rural areas, and I'm talking, 3 decades back, 4 decades back, there was this concept of booth capture or ballot stuffing. So what used to happen was that sometimes the dominant political parties would take over the booths, and by using muscle power, to put it mildly, and stuff the ballot boxes in the favor of their candidates. And this thing could be done really quickly because obviously there was no machine or timing involved. With the EVMs, this kind of a thing is tough because EVMs don't work like that. That if you press the button repeatedly without a reset, that you can register a lot of votes quickly. That doesn't work with them. Second is the fact that somewhere in the 90s, a gentleman called T.N. Seshan, who became the Chief Election Commissioner of India, took over. And
I remember meeting him a long time ago, a few times.
Yes.
He was jolly good fun. He was cracking good fun.
Yeah. So he took over the election commission and he introduced some very far-reaching reforms, which made sure that the practice of using money power and muscle power in deciding the course of elections was highly curtailed. That is not to say that they're not used, but to argue that the entire process gets vitiated by a few incidents here and there is simply not being truthful, I would say.
So fundamentally, the voting is largely free and fair, and the votes are both recorded and counted.
Yes.
Correct?
Yes.
Brilliant. So we've moved on from the days of booth capturing. And by the way, in Bihar, which is where my grandmother comes from, booth capturing was endemic in certain parts of Bihar.
Yes.
And muscle power was extraordinarily important if you wanted to run for office. And I'm told even in some other states like Andhra and UP and a few others, you needed to have muscle power, otherwise it was all finito. So that's that. You mentioned electronic voting machines. Of late, there has been criticism of electronic voting machines. There have been allegations that people can tamper with them. There is suspicion that the ruling party, the Bharatiya Janata Party, the BJP, is somehow hacking into the EVMs to make sure they get 400 seats plus. What is the merits in such allegations? Are they A, fake news, or B, wild speculations that are completely paranoid, or C, do they have some basis in a potential reality, if not reality?
From things that appear so far and going by the various challenges in the highest courts of the land and their dismissal, um, it would be a stretch to say that the EVMs can be tampered. Uh, there isn't much to suggest that. In fact, to better elucidate this point, we should dial back to the era of 1960s. And 1960s was a very interesting period because India was deepening its friendship with the Soviet Union, and Mr. Nehru had, departed the scene. There was much confusion in the Congress, and it had been taken over by Nehru's charismatic daughter, Indira Gandhi. Now,
who liked
people,
the Soviets a lot.
No, most people, I'll come to that. Most people underrated her in the sense that they thought that she wouldn't last in the elections. So they thought that she would lose election after election. But what happened was that she continued winning elections. So the poor opposition back then was a precursor of current party in power, Bharatiya Janata Party. Its precursor was Bharatiya Jansangh. So the Bharatiya Jansangh leaders back then, some of them, hypothesized that maybe the ink that was being used had some special features, So basically, it resulted into overcounting of the Congress votes. Whereas the fact was that from time to time, people come out with these things, I guess, to keep the morale of their cadres up. The reality is that it is the voters who decide, and if the electorate has made up their mind, few things can stop them. And this idea that somehow or the other the process can be vitiated on the staggering scale. Now look at it from the numbers scale. If somebody is to say that, in India, tampering is feasible, India has electorate that numbers around 965 or 68 million people. Now, if one were to try to vitiate something for this huge exercise with a huge logistical tree, it's almost impossible to keep these things secret. So this is analyzing from another aspect that, okay, fine, you can give it to the conspiracy theorists that, okay, let's see it. But the problem is that to make allegations is very easy, but to really substantiate your point in a court of law or even within the court of the people, I think that's not happening.
Indeed. So, very simply, the election process has remained largely robust right from the early days of the Indian Republic, and even charismatic leaders like Indira Gandhi did not quite tamper with it. She did impose emergency in 1974, if I remember correctly. Or was it 75? 75. And that lasted till 1977. But she lost the polls in 1977. So importantly, as far as India is concerned, you can safely say that for all its faults, the Indian Republic has not seen a leader who manages to stuff ballots at a national level and completely vitiates the sanctity of the process of elections. So Indians have been casting their votes, and their votes have been counted, regardless of which party is in power. Now, so much so about the sanctity of the elections. Recently, there has been some controversy over the Election Commission, the body that conducts the elections. And for those of our viewers and listeners who are outside India, during India's elections, politicians are not in charge. There is an independent election commission in charge that takes over administration of the entire country. And it conducts these elections at a nationwide scale. And T.N. Seshan was the chief election commissioner. The CEC, as the term became known during his day. And the CEC is, during the period of the elections at least, the de facto administrator of India. And so the Election Commission has acquired a certain bit of sanctity in the Indian imagination. It is largely a robust institution. But recently there's been controversy that no, it is not quite as independent as it was in the past. Perhaps it might not even be that fair. Over to you, Manu. What do you think?
You see, questions about the EVMs, questions about the chief election commissioners, question about
chief election commissioner and the election commissioner.
And the two deputies that he has, election commissioners.
Exactly.
The
three wise men.
Yes. The questions about them, you see, are largely a result of what you can call the opposition's search for, for the answers to its underperformance. So there are people,
or maybe not answers. They are searching for excuses. They probably know
I'll be charitable.
Why they are underperforming.
I'll be charitable there, and what happens is that often you have a political scenario in which certain people on a spectrum are very convinced that this state of affairs would merit democratic, what you can call, landslide in the favor of the opposition, but that never happens. So if that doesn't happen, and if one is ideologically very convinced about their position, then what do? You start looking for answers as to what could explain the current situation. And then you have the allegations of maybe non-level playing field, things being tampered with, so all sorts of allegations and conspiracy theories start flying. Whereas the problem actually may not be with the process or the people, it actually may be with the performance and the packaging of the political players themselves. I mean, it's very hard, I guess, because politicians tend to have very big egos. It's hard for them to really accept that, well, somebody else got chosen over them. So
I guess in a country where only 543 members of parliament represent 1.4 billion people, obviously their ego will be...
Yes, and it's highly deflationary to use economic for the egos to lose an election, and from their perspective, basically lose it for no particular reason. So
let's please finish.
So here's the thing, to those who may still see, okay, well, still there may be some merit, one must consider the opposition. There is another player in this whole affair of election, which is the Supreme Court, the highest court of the land. And if indeed there are verifiable or substantiated allegations, they would take action. But so far, nothing has materialized. And that has been the case over successive election cycles now.
All right, so let's move on to Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, who is a powerful Prime Minister, who some would say has been an extraordinary Prime Minister in building roads and ports and infrastructure and targeted welfare delivery, and so on and so forth. And some would say he's authoritarian, he's almost dictatorial, and so on and so forth. The question I have for you is a rather dispassionate one. Let's forget about Narendra Modi for a minute. Let's simply talk about elections, or rather the process of elections. Has there been any major change, or have there been any major changes in the post-Modi era that are significantly different to the pre-Modi era? What does the landscape of, what does the election process look like in the pre-Modi era and the post-Modi era?
You see, in a way, Modi's ascent is a result of the free and fair elections introduced in the 90s by TN Session and the EVMs. What that did was that it ensured that people actually became aware that their vote mattered, and they felt the stakeholdership in the democracy. So prior to that, there was, like in the majorly underdeveloped parts of the country in India, at times the electorate won't even turn because they were afraid, or there could be booth stuffing. So people would say, okay, you know what?
Well, they were simply put, they were afraid of their physical safety in many villages.
Indeed.
That if they showed up to vote, there would be retribution.
Yes.
Either then and there or later.
Yeah. So with the reforms introduced in the 90s, the Model Code of Conduct, whereby the administrative powers of the state and the central government were withdrawn during the election process, whereby police forces from other states or other organizations were sent to oversee the elections, that resulted in greater confidence in the entire process, and people started to turn up at the booths and vote more. And leaders like Modi, I'll also name Mr. Arvind Kejriwal of another party, Aam Aadmi Party.
Aam Aadmi Party, a relatively new party for our listeners and viewers around the world.
Yeah.
It began.
It means common man's party.
Yeah, and it began after the anti-corruption movement that happened a decade or so ago.
So what these two parties, who've enjoyed relative success after 2014, did was to first leverage technology. They used social media way better than the legacy party Congress, which basically thought that, that they were irreplaceable. Just like any legacy business, they were just too late to come to the party and change their ways. Second,
arguably, they still haven't changed their ways. That's what critics of the Nehru family say.
Yes, some
and the family still rules the roost in the party.
Yes. Which is quite ironical because Rajiv Gandhi, one of the prominent members of the family, was responsible for introduction of quite a few high technology industries and learning courses in India during the 80s. So it's ironical from that perspective. But then again, this is politics. So the BJP, especially Prime Minister Modi, has leveraged technology, and that technology has resulted in greater activism. That activism has percolated down to what you can call the voter lists in India. They're published by pages. So they have these page leaders, in a way you can call, whereby or page in charges. So for all the votes on a page of that voting sheet, They would depute some young person, somebody who's active in social media, to basically go and urge those voters to come out and vote, and hopefully for Prime Minister Modi. So that has been the big change. The other big change, a controversial one, was about campaign finance, election finance. So since the 50s, right after the first election of independent India, there were allegations, rumors around how political parties were financing their campaigns. And most of the time, the campaign funds would be in what would be called black money or cash. Now, there was this theory that that most of it was untaxed money, and that money was being routed to the political parties by various businesses or business owners. And that resulted in a sort of cronyism, which was very hard to detect and call out for the electorate because there was no paper trail. So to counter that, they devised of this idea called the electoral bonds, in which companies could or corporate entities could directly donate to political parties through a banking channel. That was supposed to be a secret one, accessible only to perhaps the Election Commission or the Supreme Court of India. So about that scheme, I think the Supreme Court of India struck it down, and their view was that this scheme caused an unnecessary shadow of doubt, about as to how the campaign finance for various political parties is going on, and whether the secret donation bit is good or not. That it should be public.
Very interesting. So, what you're telling me is that the change really happened during T.N. Sessions' era. And since then, the election process hasn't changed much. There's not much difference between the era before Modi and the era after Modi becomes Prime Minister, correct?
Yes.
Brilliant. Okay, so we'll move on to the next question. 2 decades ago, a famous politician said that elections are all about money, muscle, and mass appeal. I'm sure you can guess who that politician was. We are not playing in a quiz game, but shall we say he was colorful?
Yes, indeed.
And in the US, and powerful. In the US, elections are all about money, and yes, star power matters too. In fact, I'll never forget the headline when Obama showed up at Hollywood. Hollywood knows a star when it sees one. And I'm talking about the 2008 elections. So the US also has some of that. The Kennedys exuded star power. And now, what is the role of money in Indian elections?
Well, money plays a significant role, but not in the way that people imagine. So it has evolved. So let's say 3-4 decades ago, the role of money was primarily two-pronged. First was about campaign finance. Second, it was about offering inducements. So electoral bribery was a very common thing a few decades back, and candidates or their parties would often distribute money or other material stuff to win votes. Now that has shifted. So
I remember the days when I have seen with my own eyes people giving sacks of currency notes. This is many decades ago, of course. I'm getting old. I grow old, I shall wear the bottoms of my trousers rolled. T.S. Eliot, by the way. And in those days, all sorts of people got money from newspaper editors to mullahs in charge of powerful mosques to temple priests to college principals, student leaders. I think it'll be very difficult, Manu, to come up with an exhaustive list. But the bottom line is you gave people the equivalent of Italian brown envelopes, except that they weren't envelopes, they were sacks, or what in Hindi we'd call boris.
Yeah. So, that political model relied heavily on these intermediaries, So they would basically try and woo these intermediaries and ensure that there's a good turnout in their favor. Now, what has changed? Now, currently, the governments have been successful in bypassing the intermediary layer by using their welfare schemes, which are digitally transferred to the bank accounts. So that intermediary layer has basically been wiped out or is on the decline. And the use of cash, therefore, has gone down significantly from that perspective. But on the other side, the campaign finance has become very expensive. You look at the number of helicopters, you look at the number of chartered airplanes, you look at the number of hotel rooms that get booked. Clearly, most political parties have to spend a bit to stay relevant, irrespective of them being in power or not. So campaign finance, yes, has become very expensive. And
so where does the money come from? Because in the US, you have all these donors, you go to birthday parties, you go to fundraising dinners, you have electronic campaigns, you always have YouTube ads of Joe Biden and all sorts of different candidates. And Joe Biden is the president asking for money, asking for $10, $20. So as for some estimates, congressmen end up spending 60 to 70% of their time fundraising. How does the process operate in India? Do they do the same? Do they go around to dinners and birthdays and marriages? And do they make calls half of the day or 60 to 70% of the day begging for money?
See, the campaign finance in India till the introduction of electoral bonds was a simple one in which you would have mostly cash donations coming into the coffers of the political party, and they would get deposited.
From where? Who would pay?
Anonymity. There would be anonymous sources. And that's
But that's okay. But like, what would be the broad brush? What sorts of people would be making those cash payments?
See, mostly they'll be businessmen. Mostly they'll be people with cash, real estate folks with, businesses that generally run off the rolls. There would be other big businesses, conglomerates, who would give their money by check. Because, so there is the formal economy, and people from formal economy pay formally. And then there is the big informal economy, which is often referred to as the black economy, but it's just untaxed economy, perhaps. So that informal economy also contributed, but they would always pay by cash. So there was a move recently to curtail even that by introducing electoral bonds and making the rules strict about accepting cash donations by political parties. But as of now, it looks like there were some significant drawbacks in that scheme, and the Supreme Court has struck it down. So I guess a reformed new process would emerge perhaps sometime into the future.
And what were the drawbacks in the scheme as per the Supreme Court? What were the main arguments for striking down this scheme?
The main argument was about the anonymity of providing campaign funds to a party and the possibility or a probability of some kind of a quid pro quo that might
understood behind the scenes, because
so they said that one should keep
because it wasn't in the open.
Yeah, anonymous. But then there were others who argued that anonymity meant that they were saved from political persecution, the donors. So there were arguments both
That's
ways.
also a point.
On balance, I think the court found that the argument against anonymity was perhaps stronger. So they took the decision that they took.
So much so for the striking down of the electoral bond scheme. We've covered that. That was something I intended to cover during this interview because it's been in the news. There's something else that has been in the news, and that is often the talk outside the news in WhatsApp groups, etc. And that is this allegation of crony capitalism. And my question to you is more systemic. I won't name business houses. I won't name politicians. That's not the point. My point is, do political parties in India engage in crony capitalism to fund their elections?
You see, for any democracy, for any election process, there will be a fundamental need to raise campaign finance. And that finance has to emerge from certain sources. Back in the British era, when India was becoming free, the campaign finance even then had industrialists and prominent trading house contributing to the parties of their choice, and the legacy has continued. So to argue that that one set of party with its business favorites leads to cronyism, while for the others it doesn't. I mean, that's not how it kind of pans out. The cronyism becomes a serious problem when there are strong quid pro quos and a tilting of the, let's say, playground for business interests or business environment. And if it's not the case, then I guess every party will have their favorites, and they would help each other out.
So, I'll push you a bit more on this, because in Europe, money is not as big a deal as in the US. We've both lived in both Europe and in the US. We know the difference. Elections don't cost an arm and a leg. In the US, elections cost a lot, but there are institutional ways of giving money. So you have campaign contributions, you have PACs, political action committees, you have super PACs, and they may not be entirely ethical, but they are certainly legal. In a lot of developing countries, India is not an exception there, a lot of money is used in elections, but there are no institutional mechanisms. So often politicians engage in favoring an industrialist, favoring a few businesses in real estate, in giving industrial licenses, in championing, say, some retail house. And of course, the quid pro quo is that those who champion them pay money to the big parties. Now, currently in India, two political parties, one ruling and one opposition, are both sort of under some cloud of suspicion for engaging in crony capitalism. There's no reason for me to name parties, because this is a question about system. This is not a question about X party does this, Y doesn't, because as I understand it, every party engages in some form of crony capitalism just to fund the election. My question is that, does it happen? And if so, what is the scale of it? And are we moving to more institutional, transparent ways to fund elections?
Well, we have been moving towards increasing levels of transparency when it comes to campaign finance.
And you could argue election bonds are an example of that move for all their faults.
For all its faults, it was a move. And the demand for the electoral bonds is not really a one-party demand. It was raised by a lot of other parties too. The only questions around it were, the implementation of it. And party in power, party in opposition, everybody accepted those bonds. So they participated in the scheme, both of them, like all sides. I would not even say both. There were even smaller parties that participated.
Of course, there were regional parties.
Same scheme. Yeah. So to call that outright cronyism, I would suspect is not the case. As with any mature democracy, the capitalist class also participates actively within, the political process. And the way of participation is to donate to all parties, by the way. So it's not the case that Indian business houses have only one favorite. So they would actually have people, who they would be supporting in the opposition, they would be supporting in the ruling party.
Understood.
And so they
spread their bets. They spread their bets.
They have to do business with everyone, So from that perspective, I would say it isn't a bit like East Asian style cronyism or, something that we saw in Indonesia. It's not that. It's definitely not that. Participation of big business houses and trading houses within a political process cannot be, straight away stamped as being cronyism.
Join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.